All right, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. Really looking forward to the session today on a super relevant topic. My name is Adam Hertel. I'm the Naturally San Diego Program Committee Chair as well as board member. Quick plug, I'm just going to do a little bit of an intro here before we get into the content. For those who might not be familiar with Naturally San Diego, we are a nonprofit group supporting the natural products industry in San Diego by providing impactful networking, education, and resources to our membership. We exist to serve our brand community in the various aspects of the CPG industry. Many of you might not yet be Naturally members, so we do encourage you to please join us if you're not a member yet, or your respective Naturally chapter locally, if you have one in your local city. You can register at our website, naturallysandiego.org, or the respective website for your local chapter if you're outside of San Diego. Today's webinar, notably, is held in partnership with our sponsor, RSM, which provides businesses with tax and consulting services to the middle market and has been a key supporter of Naturally San Diego. They are the fifth largest CPA firm in the country and are in 120 countries globally. So big thanks to RSM for the partnership and for hosting this super valuable and timely session with us. And with that, I also want to introduce our new executive director, Renee Solaris, who joined Naturally San Diego just last month. We're thrilled to have Renee aboard. We want to welcome her. And for those of you, many of you probably who have not met Renee in person yet, hopefully you can do so at an upcoming event. But Renee, go ahead and introduce yourself if you want to do a quick intro.
Yeah, just thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This is a really important webinar, and I'm just so happy that you're all here in this conversation to hear from RSM. And yeah, just please feel free to reach out anytime. I would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Excellent. So we're in for a packed hour of content. As I said, we'll get right into it. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Connor Leckman. Connor is an assurance senior manager at RSM, where he provides financial audit services to a variety of private sector entities. He focuses primarily on CPG companies as well as professional services and technology sectors. So with that, I will hand it over to Connor. We'll get started. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam, for the intro, and good morning, everybody. I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues, Michael Williams, who is a consulting manager who specializes in operations and supply chain. Michael's going to be managing the Q&A, so please feel free to send questions his way, and we'll do our best to manage them during the presentation. While Michael's monitoring the Q&A, please also note there is a chat option as well. The chat is for the audience to have open dialogue and discuss relevant topics around the webinar if you're interested. The Q&A is for questions you'd like to be brought up during or at the conclusion of the presentation. If we don't get to your question during the presentation, we'll save it for the end. And additionally, I'll be asking some questions throughout the webinar myself, and your question might get addressed that way. And then I'm also joined by Peter Raymer, who is a senior analyst focused on the consumer products industry at RSM and works alongside our firm's chief economist. He's part of our Eminence program as one of our firm's leading experts in the CPG space. And the purpose of today's webinar will be to discuss the ever-changing and fluid global trade landscape, including tariffs. We'll hopefully be able to provide everyone with some useful insights as well as provide some useful solutions to the issues facing many consumer product companies right now. And so without further ado, I'll pass it on over to Peter to take it away.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll jump right in. There's certainly a lot to talk through today. Kind of to start out, you may have been following the news. There's certainly a lot that's been happening this year, but let me catch you up a little bit on what's happening in navigating trade, and then we'll get into some more specifics as we go along. We have a lot of great questions that I'll hopefully answer and fill in some information for you. So certainly tariffs have created a significant economic uncertainty due to, policy changes, legal challenges, overall economic instability. And so that's why it's a key topic for us to discuss. It's also kind of ongoing. If we look at what has happened with some tariffs through China, we've seen quite the change over time. From the start of this, multiple pauses, escalation up to 145%. And then back down to 30% in May as we continue to have these ongoing discussions. So that's why this becomes a key driver, a key conversation, not only for consumer product companies, but within food and beverage as well. Then if we look at effective tariff rates, we really started the year at 2.2% effective tariff rate across all countries and different products. And then we went up past 25% and now have kind of settled at 18.6% as of kind of most recent data, but we continue to see changes. There's conversations even as recently as yesterday on renewed tariffs and changing tariffs. And so that's why it becomes such a key conversation for us to have and how it impacts businesses. Throughout all of this volatility, there are still many things that businesses can do to help mitigate these circumstances, to win over their competition, still grow their customer base. And so those are some of the things that hopefully we can give you insight as we proceed forward. So just quickly as a reminder, and I'm sure these are even out of date, right? There's been tariffs across many different countries in the world, specifically when we're talking about many of the food and beverage companies, Canada, Mexico, China, as well as, Brazil, India, Korea, Vietnam, many others, the EU, that have all played a bigger role. And this complexity has certainly added to many of the challenges we've had. So that's kind of our introductory piece, and then we'll get into some more detail, some more insights as we go along.
Okay, perfect. So Peter, what economic factors are businesses and consumers contending with as they consider changes in trade?
Yeah, great question. So one thing that I think is just really important to understand is we are in a different economic environment than we were even 15 years ago. So over the last 15 years, the complexity of businesses have grown threefold, fivefold in their supply chains, as well as in many other things around their business. That creates a burden for small and medium-sized companies, and certainly all of this tariff complexity adds to it. So it's very important to understand that those underlying trends, as well as we have higher interest rates, right? That's a frequent topic right now. It used to be that you could really invest in some of these companies, do a lot of M&A activity because the borrowing cost was very small. Whereas now with higher cost of capital, that really changes the game. Companies are being much more careful in how they invest, that they're seeing the return on investment, that they have a much more timely return on investment. And then lastly, that means that the industry knowledge required to run a business is that much more important. You have to focus on lowering your costs, increasing your sales, obviously leading to increased margins and profitability. And the way you do that is through the competitive advantages of understanding your industry, what your customers want, as well as all of these underlying economic trends that we're going to continue to talk about today.
Got it. So Peter, with the latest jobs report coming in at 73,000 new jobs, are there additional concerns around a slowdown?
Yeah, so it has been interesting to look at the labor market. It certainly, unemployment has remained low, but recently we've seen some cracks in that labor market. There's been lower number of hirings, but at the same time, supply has also decreased. Immigration is certainly at a recent low. And so that's allowed unemployment rate to remain at that 4.2%. But the last 3 months, as you'll see in some of these other charts as well, have really shown lower job market numbers. That's what's led the Fed to signal that they may start cutting rates potentially in September. It also may be a reason why the Fed potentially could hold off if they have stronger job reports. But that break-even point may be around 75,000 hirings each month. When we see numbers lower than that, that causes the Fed to look at that dual mandate of unemployment as well as reducing inflation. And so they're in that tough spot of trying to manage both of those at the same time. We've had low unemployment overall, so there is room here, but that can affect overall spending of consumers, GDP growth, and growth for businesses overall. And so if we look at a few more of these charts, right, continuing jobless claims have kind of settled out, but recently increased as well. So it's just something that everyone's keeping a close eye on. You can see in this chart, the last three bars right here were that lower. It's been revised down within May. We had a slightly higher numbers within July, but we're looking very closely at what those numbers will be in August to see if there's a slowdown overall. So it's definitely a key factor for food and beverage companies as they look to both employ and grow their businesses, as well as they're looking to see if consumers continue to have the ability to spend.
So with the impacts of the labor market, should businesses be expecting a slowdown in retail sales heading into the fall?
So yeah, definitely an interesting question. As we look at retail sales, there's a few factors that give us encouragement, right? Real wage growth has remained above pre-pandemic trends. Obviously, that's just overall. There's a variety of those numbers. Some, incomes and certain jobs have been lower. Others have been higher, but overall, there is some ability for them to spend. We are seeing that older adults, right, have more of that wealth. So there is a bifurcation in both incomes as well as wealth that businesses really need to understand as they're marketing to their customers and understanding what money that they may have to spend overall. So it's something that a lot of the wealth is tied up with an equity as well, which can create challenges for consumers to continue to spend, but they are spending. We are seeing some resilience in that spending overall. If we look at this chart, we've actually seen some up and down, a lot of volatility. There was a pullback in May as these tariffs really hit, and people didn't know if this was going to be a longer issue, potentially recession, right? Then as some of these tariffs paused, consumers pulled forward some of their back to school spending and other spending in June and July. So we saw a little bit of that increase back. But there's still concern now that as tariffs continue and as people have pulled forward some of those spendings, there may be a slowing and cooling overall as time goes on. And with that in unpredictability of tariffs, you can't go from a 2.2% effective tariff rate to an 18.6% percent tariff rate and not change prices, which then affects overall people's budgets and ability to spend. So let's see, I think I've got one more here. This is just another chart that shows some of the volatility that we're seeing within those retail sales, and consumers really are paying attention to their budgets, to some of this tariff news, and reacting to it. So that's what makes this a really timely conversation. And then if I look at delinquencies for credit cards, those have been on the rise for credit card data as well as within auto. Auto loans have now elongated. We're seeing 7-year auto loans. There was a pause on student loans for a long period of time. And of course, those have come back. So all of those factors put financial pressure, especially on the lower incomes, to be able to continue to spend. There's SNAP changes when it comes to food purchases as well. So depending on who your customers are, that can really affect whether they're going to be able to continue to spend. It means that businesses really need to tailor their products. They maybe need to still have higher end products to maintain margins from their more well-off consumers, but also have products that can be affordable for their lower income consumers. And we can see that in the consumer sentiment data as well. Oftentimes, consumer sentiment follows a lot of gas prices and isn't necessarily tied to other pieces. We're seeing that more tied to and correlated to tariffs and some of the news. We had a huge dip in consumer sentiment in the May timeframe that bounced back as it was understood that there may be not some brinkmanship around those tariffs, but those have decreased a little bit as time has gone on and tariffs have continued to resume. But through all of this, we have seen a lot of resilience from consumers overall.
So Peter, how are tariffs affecting inventory levels for businesses?
Sure. So that's another challenge for businesses as they try to navigate these tariffs. There was a lot of pull forward of inventory early in the spring as they heard tariffs were coming, as multiple pauses even occurred. And so that actually lowered GDP overall. But it has allowed businesses to maintain costs and prices for longer without needing to raise prices because they've had inventory in stock and can continue to sell, with those lower prices. But for many of these businesses, if it hasn't happened already, they are running out of that inventory. A little bit with the pause around May, people were able to pull in some more purchases, and even in August with some specific examples, coffee right before tariffs raised later. But this is a tricky game for businesses of they don't want to overstock and have inventory overhang, and at the same time, how do they make sure that they're buying enough and not being disrupted by potentially large companies later on and be disrupted from getting the inventory that they need, whether that be for the holiday season later on. The other challenge is with currency as well, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. But they're in a tight spot of trying to understand and anticipate these tariffs, of when to buy, where will tariff rates be in the future, and how do they maintain their prices for kind of as long as they can. So we can see that some more in these imports affecting economic growth. We had the lower GDP growth in first quarter because of more imports that bounced back a little bit in second quarter, but overall we're seeing a GDP at a lower run rate than we have in past. And so that's some concern overall for long-term growth for businesses. And then lastly, we can see some more of that racing across against that inventory clock. And we can see that retail inventory is running low overall, which creates a risk of retailers needing to restock at a higher price.
Should companies be considering ways to hedge against currency fluctuations?
Absolutely. So one of the things that businesses are trying to determine is, with a falling dollar value, do they buy now when that dollar is potentially stronger, or if they wait, potentially, looking for a lower tariff rate, etc., will the dollar have fallen lower, which decreases their purchasing power? So that's where that kind of double bind comes in, both trying to predict this volatile tariff rates as well as seeing this dollar with some volatility and lower value overall. So I think there is multiple ways that businesses can hedge against the dollar, whether that be with long-term contracts, with adjusting and pulling forward some of those purchases. And we'll talk about a few more of those mitigation techniques in a little bit.
Perfect. So this is probably a tough one, just given how unpredictable everything is, Peter. But will tariffs increase further or expand into additional categories? Or asked another way, what products or SKUs are most vulnerable to tariff hikes right now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the of course overarching answer is we don't know, and that's what makes this a little tricky, is because so many of these are policy decisions. New tariffs are coming up for different reasons, such as with Brazil, we'll talk about here in a second, all the time, that do make it very difficult to predict. And so again, there's still many of these techniques that we can use to try to hedge against this volatility and unpredictability. But many of these things are not following a normal track of reaction because they're driven through policy decision. That said, we can, highlight and help educate on some of the recent tariffs we're seeing and how they affect. So this, first bullet point one is really a key one. So on August 15th, right, the Trump administration expanded the list of goods subject to 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. And so they expanded it to include packaging materials. So you can think about, components of dairy products and food preparation, and other packaging materials. And so that really came as a shock to a lot of people, because then again, that can affect food and beverage companies. There is a period, the Department of Commerce created a process where in May, September, and January, it can open up 2-week submission windows to allow companies to ask for additional products to be included or changed with those tariffs. And so this actually was a result of kind of that first window previously. But this is, I think, a key piece for people to keep an eye on because it may affect, your business in a different way, even if it's just a component of that price overall. And then when we look at different products, right, that are affected, certainly coffee is one of them, right? Brazil had a 40% increase from their base tariffs on things like coffee, textiles, meat, stone, as well as other products related to some of the disagreement around their president and the president being a political, or previous president, I should say, being a political ally of the Trump administration, and he's facing trial for an attempted coup. There's some disagreement around that. That's leading to that 40% increase. And so that becomes a tricky situation of how do you lower it? It's kind of unrelated to these different businesses involved. But a third of American coffee comes from Brazil. It's got, the special kind of coffee. I believe Starbucks only uses coffee from Brazil. It definitely makes it harder for other businesses to substitute with different types of coffee, changes mix, ingredients, etc. I know a few examples. Gregory's Coffee was lucky. They had a shipment arrive from Brazil on August 2nd before the higher tariffs kicked in. So they've got a supply until mid-November. Others, right, might have a much shorter supply before this leads to potentially higher costs, as well as, just change in recipes from where they're buying from. And so that has led to some lower price purchases overall. There's more product categories other than coffee. Maybe I'll skip ahead just a quick second to these bottom couple slides, but we're seeing within cocoa, this is a chart of that cocoa prices. Those continue to remain high, and that's affecting different businesses as well. And then, of course, they're, not related to tariffs, there is changing consumer spending. Consumers are spending more on sports and nutrition drinks, less on alcohol, drinks with protein. And so there's anticipated growth within that sector. And so these are really important for food and beverage businesses to understand and make sure that they're aligning themselves to those changing trends in spending. And then I think I've got one more. This, of course, is less food and beverage related, but I think just demonstrates the point. So copper initially had 50% tariffs, but then those changed as the kind of the definition of what those tariffs would apply to was changed. And so that caused a huge drop in the copper price overall. And so I think that's important for businesses to understand as well, is that these tariffs can be complicated. They can have different definitions of when they apply and that they can change quickly. So it's important for businesses to pay attention to, especially their core ingredients, their core inputs that lead to their products.
Perfect. And Peter, you jumped to a slide that was had some trade negotiation notes on there. I guess, is there any expectation or likely outcomes of the ongoing negotiations, say with China or with, US, Mexico, Canada?
Absolutely. Yeah, we showed that chart earlier that the tariff effective rate is really at that 18.6%, but that does continue to change. There have been trade negotiations and deals met, whether that be with the UK and with the UAE, but those continue to be ongoing. Some of the helpful things to keep in mind is there has been some deals with Mexico and Canada around continued, duty-free status with USMCA, but that's really set to change potentially at the end of October. So those deals are continuing to be discussed, and we'll have to keep an eye on it. But so far, those countries may continue to be some good countries to kind of do business with. India certainly has been an interesting country to watch as well when it comes to textiles and food and those ongoing negotiations. But then even that leads into some of the political concerns with the Ukraine-Russia war. India sells a lot of oil to Russia, and so all those considerations make it a lot of variability into these negotiations. Typically, negotiations take months and even years to fully iron out. So that leads to some of this ongoing uncertainty for businesses to look at. And then if we look at this chart around just inflation continuing, so core CPI did increase 0.32% in July, but a lot of that was anticipated. Core goods rose 0.21% in June, roughly, or in July, roughly the same as in June. And then service inflation increased month over month in July. So we are starting to see some of that inflation overall, and prices increase, but it has been lower than expected so far. And that's one of those, excuse me, big questions is, are we going to see, these prices be a one-time hike as negotiations maybe are a one-time thing, or are they going to be an ongoing thing? And that's very much tied to some of these negotiations as well as how businesses and consumers react overall to these changes.
So, Peter, this is a little bit more of a niche question, but how are food businesses and consumers reacting to changing trade conditions?
Right. So one of the things we've seen is, Americans pulled back from restaurants in May. That's a little bit mediating. There's still a lot of resilience in that restaurant space, but we are seeing businesses and consumers react to these tariffs in a couple different ways, right? Shopping out at restaurants, bars, that's a proxy for discretionary spending, the spending that they can do, with what they want, not essential spending. So that's why we look at that and see some of those correlations and help predict what consumers are going to do going forward. Overall, right, consumer sentiment has been fragile. We've seen that go back and forth as costs of living overall, whether that be electricity prices have increased. There's certainly some hope that gas prices may continue to decline as there's more production overall. And then, of course, just potential tax cuts could also, lift restaurant sales in the second half of the year, both for businesses to react as well as consumers to have, money to spend. Additionally, right, restaurants are substituting ingredients. So when, you can't import food from Vietnam, or maybe you can't import French cheese, we're seeing that substitution for Wisconsin Gouda instead. Some of those ingredients are harder to substitute, such as Mexican, avocados, etc., or tomatoes. And so that's something that there's test kitchens to try to help businesses with those substitutions, and it'll be a decision, especially from the consumer, whether they would like to pay more or if they're okay with some of these substitutions and changes in tastes.
So, Peter, should companies look to reshore, nearshore, or diversify their supply chain now?
Right. And that's a really key question. And I think some of it can be all of the above in different ways, but it's a challenging balance. So when you think about reshoring and having domestic production, in order for that to make sense, businesses would need domestic production to be cheaper than anywhere else, even if they're moving their supply chain, and this a little bit happened 8 years ago with the last administration when there were first steel and aluminum tariffs and other pieces, there was some changing of manufacturing from China over to Vietnam, and businesses really anticipated, okay, we can buy apparel and other goods from Vietnam. Now, this time around, there's tariffs, initially announced on Vietnam, so that plan didn't work quite as well as maybe certain businesses anticipated. But that's really the concern: is you have to make sure that domestic production is actually cheaper than potentially anywhere else you might be able to source it. So for some businesses, that may be shifting supply chains to a different country with a better, tariff rate. It may be bringing that to domestic production, but that takes time to invest in that domestic production, factories, permits, etc. All of those take time to build up that production locally. And where in the past there's been some more nearshoring, as they had products maybe from overseas come through Mexico or Canada and then into the United States, there are a few changes that are making that more difficult. Specifically, there's the anti-transshipment enforcement that was effective August 7th that basically imposes a 40% automatic surcharges on goods that it deems were transshipped or rerouted through other countries. So to try to avoid those tariffs. So that's just something that businesses need to be aware of, and we'll have to continue to watch and see how that's enforced. And what that looks like overall. Documentation rights going to be really critical as businesses try to avoid any of these additional fees. And then, of course, the other factor that plays a role with trying to decide, where you produce your goods is the suspension of the duty-free de minimis rule. So that's a rule that essentially says products that are in a package and worth $800 or less can be shipped duty free. Well, that's being eliminated. That certainly affects B2B, shipments of samples, maybe test runs, promo goods from potentially overseas direct to a consumer. It does change and maybe eliminate some of those e-commerce platforms from overseas that are undercutting some of the American businesses, but it also creates challenges for American businesses as well that do bring in those products from overseas, those smaller businesses especially. So that's something we need to continue to keep an eye on. Private label growth, right? Gen Z has been focusing on private label growth, and that's expected to continue to grow. So that's again something that is a way for businesses to try to understand that what the consumers are wanting and focus on that kind of going forward. So another thing that businesses can do when they think about domestic production versus foreign production and diversifying their supply chain is look at automation. One of the challenges with building products in the United States is some of the labor supply. We've had less immigration, which creates constraint on that labor supply. You saw earlier how we have low unemployment. So automation, while has its pros and cons, of course, within the unemployment, can create some steadiness in that manufacturing process, can help eliminate some of the risk going forward of potentially higher demand for workers and wages. Obviously, again, there's some trade-offs with that. You need those workers and those wages for those consumers to be able to continue to spend. But that's one of these mitigation techniques that we're seeing businesses start to use as they find a scarce labor supply and they're seeing increased costs of workers domestically. And so again, just kind of to summarize, what can businesses do around this question of nearshoring diversification? They can use forward contracts to try to lock in rates and get through this season of unpredictability. They can diversify supply chains. they can consider nearshoring to countries with currencies that are more tied to the United States. So that kind of addresses our question of what do we do about that falling US currency? If you're tied more to countries like Mexico, where the currencies are tied together, that can be a mitigating technique as well as mixing or changing up your mix of what products you sell, prioritizing those higher margin and faster moving inventory items to improve your cash flow. And then, of course, just leveraging some AI to increase productivity and efficiency overall.
Perfect. So then, Peter, what countries are still tariff friendly for sourcing certain goods?
Sure. If we look at some of the tariff percentage comparisons right now, Canada and Mexico have those USMCA duty-free exemptions. But again, that grace period goes through the end of October, so it's hard for us to know long-term what that's going to look like. Still, there's other countries, whether it be Australia, Chile, that can have some good options, the EU as well. Other countries that have higher tariff rates, even such as Vietnam, they may have such low costs where there's still some benefits, as well as depending on what the good is, such as seafood, etc., they may still be your best option. But that's something that is an evolving, kind of changing kind of rationale that we'll have to continue to look at. But I know, yeah, Canada and Mexico as our neighbors, they continue to have some potentially good options there.
Can businesses switch suppliers or manufacturing locations without sacrificing quality or lead times?
Yeah, a really key question is, okay, what do we do if we want to switch? And, how do we do that effectively? And I think there's some immediate risks, right, to doing that. Moving suppliers or manufacturers always, introduces some temporary downtimes or lead times or potential quality lapses as you're training new, equipment. You have to calibrate it, recipes, train new employees. Those new suppliers require new contracts, audits, etc., and building trust. But some of the longer, term benefits of diversifying that supply chain, switching up some of these, is if you are moving to a closer location, that can decrease lead times and lower costs of shipping those goods. You also have an opportunity to modernize that equipment potentially, but you really need that discipline change management to make that work effectively.
Gotcha. So it sounds like companies do have options, but there's a lot of unpredictability, so not necessarily one size fits all. I guess one easy solution potentially, how much of the tariff cost can businesses pass on to the customers without hurting their demand? And
Right.
is there an easy way at determining what this percentage of value is?
Yeah, really key question. I think that is, the question that everyone's trying to figure out is, okay, are tariffs being passed on, those costs? What does that look like? How much can you pass on? I think, General Motors was the latest US company to disclose how, those have affected their costs. They said that the tariff duties dented their profits by more than 1 billion as it chose to initially absorb that blow. And that helps explain why car prices didn't initially rise in the inflation data more recently. But I think overall, right, that's something that can't stay forever. I'll, say it multiple times, but we can't go from that 2.2% effective tariff rate to 18.6% tariff rate without those price changes and still maintain those margins. I think it's just the timing and the way businesses can be creative with mixing up potentially those materials, what deals that they can make with different countries where potentially they can still gain over their competitors. But we are starting to see, businesses pass through those tariffs. If we look at the PPI, the producer price index information, we can see that that has increased. It rose the most in 3 years in July, which really just tells us that, yep, these prices are not foreign companies paying the cost of these tariffs and lowering their price. they are increasing their costs, overall related to these tariffs, and U.S. companies are paying for that. We can see that services costs increased 1.1% last month, the most since March 2022 as well. And so overall, these are things we want to continue to watch on. I think it has been lower, but the question is it going to continue higher? Is inflation going to increase as businesses kind of run out of that pumped up inventory and need to raise prices to save their margins? If we look at this chart, this is kind of interesting. There's two factors here: the widening gap between inflation and the PPI prices. And so when there's that gap, that really means that costs are rising faster than prices right now. So businesses are absorbing some of those. But again, it's a question of how long can that really last, and what do businesses need to do to protect their margins. If we look at this chart, I know this is kind of a lot to see, but essentially based on the relationship between the size of the tariff shock and inflation from March through July, we can see that for every 1 percentage point of tariff shock, inflation just rose 0.23%. So again, it shows us there is certainly some pass through of these prices, but also some holding back. So some of these items, had slowing inflation around major appliances, sporting goods, personal, consumers, and even apparel prices. And so again, it's this weird, tricky spot where even though consumers do have some wages to spend, consumer sentiment is low, they are apprehensive, price sensitivity. So it's preventing businesses from fully passing on some of these prices. But again, that's not something that can potentially last forever. When we look at one more kind of chart related to this, I find it really fascinating. So the number of products that have risen at a 4% rate rose these last few months. So it was 48% of product categories had that higher inflation rate, up from 46% in June and 40% in May. So really what that tells us is that there's more categories are showing some strong price increasing, reflecting tariff pass-through effects, but still some price declines suggest some softness. So again, we're seeing some back and forth with this.
So, Peter, as companies are looking to mitigate the impact of tariffs, are there cost recovery or tax credit strategies available for tariff hit imports, or
Yeah.
are there cost recovery mechanisms companies should explore?
Absolutely. And so this is where even amidst all this volatility and changes, there's actions that businesses can do to protect their margins, reduce costs, and even grow their business through this turbulent times. And so some are tariff rebates, right, and exemptions are available, especially when tariffs overlap. You can make sure that you're not paying that tariff twice. There's incentives. So increasingly, U.S. federal and state governments offer tax credits and incentives for reshoring manufacturing or investing in domestic production. But then also there's a number of kind of duty related techniques, bonded warehouses, foreign trade zones, special tariff provisions, duty drawbacks. All of these are really key for anyone who is importing outside of the country to make sure that they're keeping up to date with. I know at RSM, there's some public data that businesses can pay to get from customs of all of the information related to both tariffs and the products that you're importing. And then for RSM, we've got some trade advisory services where we essentially run some analytics on that. And most of the time we've been able to vastly pay for those costs of those services in a massive way. We've had businesses save millions of dollars over 5 years on a service that costs them just some thousands of dollars, using some of these techniques right here. And so I think that's something that's really important for businesses, especially with this continued volatility, to invest in. This is not necessarily, a one-time thing that we're seeing that businesses can handle, and that does create that burden on those middle and small businesses. So there is a lot for businesses to do, and if a business isn't doing it, your competitor likely is. So it becomes that much more important to focus on these and reduce costs however you can.
So, Peter, what's the impact if the Trade Review Act passes?
Sure. So the Trade Review Act, right, is a provision that basically gives more power to Congress in determining these tariffs. And so this is a proposed solution. And so the president wouldn't have to notify Congress within 48 hours of imposing or increasing tariffs. And so that could create some more stability. It also could elongate certain changes. This is something that we'll have to continue to see an eye on to see if this is something that Congress is willing to pass and kind of bring that oversight back into Congress, or if they'll continue to let the executive branch determine a lot of these trade policy going forward. So there's both some positives and negatives with this approach. Of businesses may face more delays and uncertainty, but overall they may alleviate some of the trade tensions and create some long-term policy overall. There is also a bunch of legal challenges related to these tariffs that you've probably heard about from the beginning. The current administration used the International Economic Emergency Powers Act to really enact these tariffs. But even if those court rulings change that, there are other ways that they could still implement these tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. So we don't see these as being, a single solution where these tariffs would be pulled back. So that's just another thing to keep in mind.
Perfect. And Peter, just so you're aware too, we're at 12 to the top of the hour, so we have just a little bit more to get through, but we're going to try and leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. One more question for you. What are the long-term margin impacts to, I guess, gross margin and EBITDA if tariffs persist through 2026?
Right, absolutely. And so, I've said it a couple times this time, but I think it's just worth repeating, is we started the year at that 2.2% effective rate. We're currently at that 18.6%. You can't make those changes without affecting those margins. So it really becomes a question of, do we have stability with some of this tariff and trade policy going forward overall? And is this a one-time shock in terms of increase of prices or a long-term inflation? That will have an effect on margins, as well as what is the consumer sentiment and spending ability for consumers to actually absorb potentially higher prices. Are they willing to do that, or are they going to pull back? And so all three of those are just key factors as we kind of look at that long-term margins. Here we can see cost increases, right? Domestic and imported kind of followed along a good trend, but then those have really fallen off the rails and gone higher up once we saw those tariff trains happened. And so the increased cost percentage overall does make a difference. Margins, so again, we've kind of said margins will be dependent on multiple factors, and businesses will have to figure out how they can potentially change products without sacrificing quality, adjust their mix, potentially gain still higher margins from those fast-moving products from higher incomes that have the ability to spend. Well, they may get less from some of those lower incomes, but they still have to manage that overall. And then, again, this is just an interesting price scenario with a 10% tariff impact. That is something that businesses could potentially pass on and maintain margins. If, looking back, this was previous with high tariff rates on China. If there had persisted 125% tariffs rates or even higher, that requires businesses to increase prices by 50, 60, 70, 80%. And some of those really become not feasible for businesses to continue to run. So that where that number lands and how much it impacts the inputs is really key for businesses going forward. And so again, there's a lot of information here overall, but tariffs are affecting consumers' loss in spending ability each year with those higher costs. It just matters of, okay, is this a long-term piece or not? So businesses really will have to proceed carefully in trying to navigate those margin changes. But one way that they can do that is through some AI and leveraging tools to make them even more efficient in how they build their products. So a study by MIT was really interesting. They found that boards that had not just digital savvy boards, but AI savvy boards actually saw average return on equity that was 10.9% higher than other companies without savvy boards. It used to be you just needed to be digitally savvy, and they saw an improvement and a difference. That changed in 2024. Now they're seeing that businesses really need to have some of this AI savvy, and we're seeing a lot of really interesting ways that AI is being used in food companies, similar to pharmaceuticals, in the way that they mix their products, find ingredients that are pleasing, reduce costs, kind of, etc. And so one of the surveys that we found at RSM was fascinating. 70% of businesses said they needed outside help to get the most out of their AI. 62% said generative AI has been harder to implement than they expected. But I think most importantly, and I found encouraging, because that's the big question, is AI, is it living up to the hype? Is it actually saving margin? 88% of these businesses that we surveyed said that it affected their organization more positively than they expected. So I find a lot of encouragement in trying to use all of these avenues holistically to maintain margins for businesses.
So then, Peter, kind of just tying it all together and wrapping it up. I guess what are some of the major takeaways that businesses can take and need to know as they move forward with the shifting landscape?
Absolutely. So, consumers, I would say, are cautious with all these economic headwinds. They're price sensitive. There's higher interest rates. There's uncertainty. So a lot of those are headwinds. Businesses are in a bind as they try to manage this unpredictability and inventory costs. There's decline in the dollar. So there's a lot of those headwinds. But I would also say these create opportunities for businesses to disrupt. We're seeing a lot of smaller businesses that are disrupting some of the previous big players in incredible ways. So I think lean into that. What can businesses do? They, again, this kind of copies what I had before, but they can use forward-looking contracts. They can diversify their supply chains to mitigate risks. They can hedge against the dollar with countries that are more tied to our dollar. They can leverage AI as well as kind of change up their mix and quality of products to maximize their margins and understand where the consumer's at, both with their purchases, what they're interested in, what types of drinks, etc., that they are interested in with the change in consumer spending. All of these are factors that together will help businesses kind of grow and thrive, even in kind of a very disruptive time.
Awesome. Okay, I think, Peter, that concludes the presentation. And we do have a couple questions that came in. I was going to say, just because we only have a few minutes left, Peter, if you wanted to go to a couple of slides from here, we just
Sure.
wanted to share our information too. If anybody does have to drop at the top of the hour, this is our email addresses. You can also find us on LinkedIn if you guys did have any additional questions.
Yeah,
But
please feel free to reach out. Yeah.
and then, so Peter, the two questions we have as of now, what is RSM's estimate of the probability of a recession in the next 12 months?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. Earlier in the year, we had a higher, even above 50% probability of recession when tariffs kind of first hit in April. We've really pulled that back. So I don't know if I've got the current number of what that is. but I think we're now back in something like that 25% range. I think we've seen a lot of resilience within the consumer, but at the same time, depending on what policy decisions are made, and that chart that I showed a few back, if tariff prices become too high for businesses to really become feasible, that can create a quick effect. But right now, we are seeing some direct action from the Fed to be able to help with businesses and control. But I think again, there's a lot of unpredictability or unpredictable behavior that's going on right now that's creating challenges for the business. But I think at this point, we've pulled back from our recession probability. But you can always ping me later and I can make sure I'm giving you the latest up-to-date number on that.
Perfect. And then the other one we have is how do you explain to individual consumers who believe that tariffs are paid by foreign countries that it's in fact the US companies that are paying the tariffs, which is why they're experiencing price increases?
Sure. Yeah. And that's where we look at that PPI index, that producer price index, that really tells us, okay, how much are companies paying for these goods? And when that price rises, right, that tells us that, okay, they're not lowering. Foreign companies aren't lowering their prices to account for, the added tax of a tariff. We are seeing that rise in the data. So I think that's some of those key pieces. We can also point to the root customs data to show that increase as well. But yeah, it's kind of a multi-layered approach. It is kind of interesting, to take slightly longer in that answer. There is multiple areas where a price can increase, whether that be buying your inputs or are you raising a price from that foreign consumer or producer or manufacturer that you're buying from? There's also that price or cost increase in what you sell to your consumer. And I think it's important to know that there are those multiple layers because there's multiple places where that can adjust to people's point of where that payment is. There's also multiple layers for where value is driven. As a consumer looks to shop for a product, they're going to look at the quality, the features, etc., and say, hey, is this worth the asking price? And as long as the price in their mind is still higher than the price you're asking for, then they may continue to buy that product, which is fantastic. So what are the things that businesses can do to drive the value in consumers' mind to continue to buy that? And some of that's adding new features, touting the health benefits, etc. So I think it's important as you look at those to look at the multiple layers of a price. But yeah, certainly we can see in the PPI data that foreign producers are not actually lowering their prices overall. Good question.
All right.
Yeah, great questions.
I don't see anything else coming in. Give it maybe just a few more seconds just to make
Sure.
sure.
And I think, the new bill, the OBBBA tax bill, there's certainly some implications in there for food and beverage companies, some SNAP changes that we're continuing to monitor that could affect businesses, especially that sell products to those lower incomes. So it can also create some tax cuts for consumers to continue to spend. So we'll continue to monitor those effects, but that will take some time for those to play out as well. But yeah, thank you guys, and feel free to reach out. Always happy to answer more questions. But I know this has been a mouthful and a lot to talk about, but I find there's a lot of opportunities for businesses to grow and be successful even in this challenging environment.
Perfect. Yes, and really quick, as Adam mentioned, we are one of the largest accounting firms in the country and the world, and can assist with tax planning compliance. We have a host of consulting services, which we can provide more information on upon request, as well as audit services. We're very happy to be partnered with Naturally San Diego and are looking forward to providing value to not only the organization, but the representative brands as well. And as Peter mentioned too, if you guys have any further questions or would like to understand how we may be able to assist you further, please feel free to reach out to us. We are available. And if we can't answer the question, we will find somebody in the firm who can. And then with that, I think we can pass it back over to Adam. So.
Awesome. Amazing. Peter, Connor, thank you so much. Yeah, what an incredibly jam-packed hour of content. Thanks for getting through so much, Peter, so quickly. That was incredibly productive, and a topic that's changing by the week. So we'll stay on top of this. I know there's going to be a lot of moving pieces, and certainly some follow-ups we can potentially do in the future as well. But again, thank you to RSM for the partnership with Naturally San Diego on behalf of Naturally Network as well. I do want to mention this recording will be shared out on our YouTube channel. So I know there's a lot of folks who probably couldn't make it live for today's session. Please share this amongst your colleagues, and forward it to anyone else who you think this could be relevant for. And we definitely want to continue to add value and get more traction out of the YouTube recording. So be on the lookout for that. And otherwise, thank you all so much for your time. And until the next one, appreciate it, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.